everybody. Welcome to those of you who have joined us today. We are very excited to have you with us for the conversation on Gender Equality Week 2020 this year, entitled Measuring Women's Empowerment, the Ways Forward in Localization. My name is Antu Hossain. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Global Health Impact Officer here at CanWaCH, the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health. And again, we are really thrilled to have you join us while we host this discussion today. Though you are all joining from across different locations today, many of you in the comfort of your home, of course. For me, home is Toronto or Tikaranto, and I am grateful for the stewards of the land who have made it possible for a settler like myself to live, work, and learn on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Awesome. So today we have a really exciting and jam-packed program for you. So we will be diving into an icebreaker very shortly. From there, we will have 5 incredible powerhouse speakers talking in various ways around measuring women's empowerment. We will then go into breakout rooms where you'll have a chance to participate in a dialogue, and then we'll come right on back to the main room and summary and close off our session for today. Today, CanWaCH is very much thrilled to be hosting this session in and around Gender Equality Week 2020. We recognize that working within the Feminist International Assistance Policy here in Canada means as well that we need to be pushing ourselves to be bolder and better with our approaches to feminist programming, stakeholder engagement, and capacity strengthening at all levels. And one of the main ways in which we are trying to talk about that today is the concept of measuring women's empowerment. Often can be an abstract concept. However, we have many experts who would like to break that down for you today. And while we also recognize that the learnings to effectively measure women's empowerment are very closely linked to how we work with our local partners and how we advance localization. And so co-creating and working closely with the communities whom are being affected with respect to measuring empowerment. And so that'll be a key theme that we address throughout today's discussion. And just a final note, this webinar is being recorded and you will have access to the recording. If you've registered for this session, you will get an email from CanWaCH when the recording as well as the slides will be uploaded for you to share widely as well. So without, to the next, actually, the breakout, the icebreaker, my apologies, the icebreaker that we have for you. I would love for you to simply go to slido.com, where I'm going to be putting the link in the chat box here. It is, if you can simply go to this link and let us know if you have any issues, but it should directly take you to an interface where you'll be primed with this specific question. Think about 3 words that you associate with measuring empowerment. So we'd love to hear from you. What comes to mind when you hear the word measuring empowerment? Let us know if you have any issues with Slido, but you should simply be able to add in the words into the descriptor box. We're going to give it a few more moments. So the grand reveal, we are getting words like multidimensional. The words that are the biggest are the ones that many people are saying frequently. Challenging, qualitative, participatory, really interesting words here, complex, rigor, ending marginalization, and locally defining empowerment for sure. I love this. This is my favorite part, is just seeing the initial reactions to this word. Complicated, self-reported, women, challenging, qualitative, participatory, and complex are definitely what are standing out here. So feel free to add more words. We will be taking this word cloud and sharing it. But this gives us a really good sense of the fact that we all definitely want to be having this conversation more and more. And so again, we're really pleased to be handing it off to a few experts. So our very first expert is Lucia Diaz-Martin from the Abdul Jamil Poverty Action Lab, and she will take it away.
Great, thank you for convening this really exciting event, and I'm very pleased to be featuring some tips and takeaways from a JPAL publication called The Practical Guide to Measuring Women's and Girls' Empowerment in Impact Evaluations, which you can also check out on our website. I'm a policy manager for JPAL's gender sector. It's a research center based at MIT. So the guidelines and tips I'll be focusing on today are related to bringing in the voices and realities of women and girls into data collection systems. Quick note, this guide is primarily geared towards quantitative researchers using survey instruments, but it does have applications for many various approaches, including program design, M&E, mixed methods research, et cetera. And we're really trying to get at some practical guidelines to addressing what was rightfully called a complex, complicated, and challenging issue of measuring empowerment. We'll cover these following 3 tips today on how measurement can support an environment to further women's agency and decision-making, and I'll walk through each of these tips one by one, starting with the first one, which is using formative research to understand the process and outcomes of agency and decision-making. Today, we're talking about empowerment and agency, so let's start out with some definitions. Economist and seminal researcher on women's empowerment, Naila Kabir, defines empowerment as the process by which those who've been denied the ability to make strategic life choices acquire such an ability. Kabir's definition of empowerment also speaks to how women draw from resources to exercise agency, and that this should lead to meaningful change in their lives in the form of achievements. So what comes through clearly in this framework is that empowerment can start with access to resources, but beyond that, it's a process that enables women to exercise choices and decisions to improve their lives in areas that are meaningful to them, and that these decisions should be realized and actualized to reflect actual empowerment. And so the manifestations of agency and empowerment will depend entirely on the local setting, of course. And so to define what we'll measure to gauge empowerment in our M&E strategy or impact evaluation, it's obviously critical to rely on the voices of women in the particular setting. So in particular, we want to conduct extensive formative research, as many highlighted in the word cloud. The qualitative component is critical to understand what empowerment looks like in our setting. We want to know, what is it that women want to do that they currently can't do? What are the norms and institutions that are blocking this process of exercising agency? And what are some possible ways to relieve these constraints? So the qualitative specialists in the room will be familiar with the kinds of research methodologies listed on the screen. So approaches that enable us to understand what the process of empowerment and agency look like in this specific setting. And so we define empowerment by hearing from women regarding the strategic life choices they want to acquire and how. And based on this rich information, we can develop a theory of change that will underpin both the program itself and the evaluation strategy. And our theory of change then should aim to measure all of the steps along the empowerment process and really interrogate whether those intended changes are happening. So on the next slide, we have an example of a research project that by JPAL affiliated researchers that did use some formative research to shape what was measured in surveys in a quantitative impact evaluation. So the evaluation was conducted by JPAL affiliated researchers Nava Ashraf, Dean Carlin, and Wesley Yin in partnership with the Green Bank in the Philippines. And the intervention was a commitment savings account that targeted women. So the savings account offered clients restricted access to their savings, thus potentially helping to protect the funds from appropriation by family members, or even help to control for additional self-discipline. And each woman defined either a goal date or amount and was subsequently only able to withdraw funds from this account when the goal was reached. So importantly, researchers didn't just want to measure take-up or access to these accounts, but actually whether these accounts helped women gain agency and decision-making power in their homes. So researchers measured self-reported decision-making, so, questions on to what extent are you involved in these important household decisions, but they also measured whether households bought more durable goods that women said they wanted. So they got this list of decisions and goods that women cared about from formative research with women and also other local research on women's preferences about how they prefer to spend money within the household. And then they measured spending on these goods before the intervention and after, and evaluated whether changes in spending patterns reflected women's preferences before and after the intervention. And so this is an example where focus groups and background research really help define what the achievements of empowerment looked like in this setting. When you have more control over resources as a result of access to these savings accounts, what does that look like in terms of actual spending and capturing some of this? So going beyond just the survey data collection and even qualitative research to look at those changes in the lived realities of households. So on the next slide, we'll jump into our second tip of the day, that we should think about complementing standardized measures with locally tailored ones. So this can help us make sure we're fully capturing women's voices. So on the next slide, we have a standardized survey question, an off-the-shelf sort of decision-making question. Who usually makes decisions about healthcare for yourself? You and your husband and partner jointly, or both, or someone else. So take a second to reflect on this question. How would you even answer it? Is the question about running to the pharmacy, which you might want to do alone, or is it about whether to schedule a surgery, which you might actually want support in deciding, right? So what are we measuring when we ask this question? The next slide features an example from a great book on empowerment by Susana Martinez Restrepo and Laura Ramos Jaimes, and it illustrates this point very well. So the dialogue on the screen is a conversation between a woman in the highlands of Peru and an interviewer, highlighting the fact that this woman's interpreting a decision-making process as joint because it involves some dialogue, when in fact it appears that the husband is the primary decision maker. So this really gets to the issue of whether we're measuring what we think we're measuring with some of those standardized off-the-shelf questions. So on the next slide, these are a co-author on the Women's Empowerment Guide, Rachel Glenister, and her research team's end result when it came to piloting and tailoring some of those decision-making questions about healthcare to the local context of Bangladesh. So in this case, the key was taking a specific decision point rather than a general one, and a concrete scenario if the child is sick or needing medicine for oneself. And so these examples were also based on extensive formative research about the constraints in this context, which were mobility. And so interestingly, the researchers did find different results when asking the standard versus the tailored version of the question, so it can be useful to collect both and kind of triangulate and complement. And of course, a good suggestion is to pilot extensively and engage in cognitive interviewing, which is when you ask respondents to think out loud as they answer you, so you can really capture how respondents are interpreting the questions during your piloting period. Another important aspect is to interrogate how we interpret empowerment related to options for decision making. So in contexts where women's choices and mobility are highly limited, we might think that being able to make choices by herself is a sign of empowerment. But in contexts where women are overburdened with huge amounts of domestic tasks, adding another thing to the list of chores to do and decisions to make with no support may actually be a sign of disempowerment. Moving on to our third tip, to use creative measurement approaches. And we understand that it's challenging to incorporate outcome level data in our data collection strategies. So a low cost informative option could be to add in questions on really important subjective matters. Obviously, what a person wants in their own life and their sense of self are key aspects of empowerment and agency. So potential topics could include perceived quality of life, happiness, stress, self-esteem, agency, self-efficacy. All of these subjective components of agency are really important, and these are just a few examples on the screen here that can help capture this in survey data. On the next slide, we're also wanting to potentially track ideas about gender norms. And one way to do this can be by using vignettes, which are hypothetical scenarios where characters face certain decisions. And vignettes can help and capture ideas about gender roles, which are with a framing that might be a little bit easier for people to answer. And on the next slide, we also have an example of vignettes to measure bargaining power. So this vignette asks a woman whether she would rather share a certain amount of money with her partner or maintain a smaller amount to herself. And researchers have found that preferring much smaller amounts to keep to herself compared to larger amounts for joint ownership are indicative of less control over resources in the home. So on the next slide, we just have a few other examples of measurement approaches to help measure the lived realities of women's and girls' lives. Structured games, direct observations, purchase decisions include some examples. So JPAL affiliated researchers Rachel Glenister, Catherine Casey, and Ted Miguel evaluated whether a community-driven development program in Sierra Leone enhance women's participation in community decision-making. So they found that while more women were attending community meetings, through direct observation and actually tallying participation in the meetings, they learned that the program didn't improve the likelihood of women speaking up in the meetings. So again, going past the first level of information to really try to observe those lived experiences. So on my final slide here, there's just some more resources to support surveys and data collection strategies and more places to get great ideas. And with that, my time is up. So I'll turn it over to Shiva speaking next.
Thank you so much, Lucia. And that was a fantastic presentation. So I'm a little bit worried about going next, but I will do my best. Thank you so much to CanWaCH as well for having me at this event. I'm super excited to be here. And thank you, Talia, for changing the slides as I try to remember to say next slide. So we can quickly go to the next slide where you'll see a picture of my face alongside my own video. I don't know why I have both, but just in case. So my name is Shiva. I am the research officer at YWCA Canada, where I'm working on a project called Born to be Bold. I'm an Iranian Canadian. My family and I immigrated about 20 years ago, so I am also a settler here in Toronto. And that's really, for me, it's also important for me to position myself where I am and where I do my research, because it's also the lens through which I approach my research. So we'll go to the next slide so we can dive right in. So talking about women's economic empowerment and empowerment specifically, I'm so glad the words that came up in the word cloud were challenging, participatory, complex, because that's how I feel every single day. So this was very reassuring. I really appreciate it. And Lucia already did a fantastic job talking about empowerment and what we mean when we talk about economic empowerment. So what I'll focus on really in the presentation is how we've approached this topic of economic empowerment in our project, Born to be Bold. But what's really critical for me to think about when we talk about empowerment is really trying to give as much agency to the women who are involved in the project to define the terms for themselves, to define what economic empowerment means to them, what the labor market means, and what access means. But we'd also be amiss to be talking about empowerment without really focusing on that power piece, and really questioning what systems and what structures have been set up in the way that the power has been distributed in the way that it is distributed. So if we really only talk about giving power to folks and not really questioning where that power structure came from, we're really missing something critical here. So for us, one of the ways to approach that is through advocacy work that is informed by the outcomes of our research. So we'll go right along to the next slide. Just a very quick overview of the project. If there's questions about the project, I'm always happy to talk about it another time, but I want to get more into the details. But it's really a project where we're collaborating with 10 YWCAs across Canada, and these are really our communities for our research. We're also engaging 5 national employers to commit to changes that come out of our research, and that's really looking at implementing the impacts and the actions that come out of our research, and really looking to build community awareness and changing attitudes of business leaders to really get at those power structures and the structure of the labor market that we've spoken to. And we'll go to the next slide. So really the question that I want to focus on in this presentation is really looking at the role of research in helping us support our goals meaningfully. So we'll go next. And when we talk about research, we talk about kind of the different types of research that exist. And like many other things, research really exists on a spectrum. And really the research that we look at is community-based, community participatory research, community-based participatory research. And there's a lot of different language that comes around it. But the key point in deciding the type of research that we do and which one is most appropriate for us is the level of engagement that the community and the participants have. So it's really critical at every step of the process to ask, to what level is the community involved? To what level do they have the ability to make decisions, access to the resources, access to funding, and really what is their role? So when we think about action, research is the oldest form. Really the focus is on planning, evaluation, and action. But the majority of the process is implemented by the primary researchers, so whether that's at an academic institution or a large organization, and the participants don't have much say in how the research is done. As we move along the spectrum and we look at community-based research, it's really talking about co-ownership by the community and the researchers. So there's power sharing at every single step, at the conception, at the ethics review, at the funding. We're really talking about partnership, the perspective of everyone is involved, and the community is really engaged as experts at every step of the research. For us in Born to Be Bold, we're kind of in the middle of that, where we try to engage, we try to implement certain aspects of participatory research, but we also have to function within certain conditions that we're given based on, and we'll talk about some of the challenges that come up. So we can't be fully participatory or have fully participatory aspects implemented. What's really important is to just be honest with ourselves and our participants about what we can and can't do in terms of the type of research we're doing. So we'll go to the next slide. So for Born to Be Bold, the broad process, we have 3 phases. We have the planning and research phase, then we moved into, now we're in the monitoring and evaluation, and the third will be the knowledge mobilization. And again, what was critical for us was at every step where we could, we would engage the women who are participating in really defining the terms that we're looking at, giving a variety of ways where they can engage in the research. And the final phase, that knowledge mobilization phase, is really key in both communicating back the findings to the community, engaging them in actually sharing back and implementing the actions, but also in terms of making sure that the outcomes of our research last beyond the research cycle, which oftentimes we don't really plan for. So going next, this is a broad overview of all of the steps that are involved in research. I know the majority of you are experts in this, so I will not go into detail about all of the steps. But again, really key at every step of the way is to ask if we're really aiming for that community-based research or community-based participatory research. Really critical to ask whether the community has co-ownership in defining in that, and it would start in that planning phase. So when we're defining or applying for funding, when we're planning the time, how much time do we need to engage the community fully, how much time do we need for feedback process, and to ask questions, and then in the design phase, really defining the goals and the questions of the research. And this is where for Born to Be Bold, this was mainly driven by us at the national office, but really engaging with our 10-member associations. We wanted to make sure, does this research make sense for you? Does it make sense for the programs that you're operating? Will the outcomes be helpful to you and the program participants? And even thinking in terms of the tools and the methods, really trying to keep a variety of tools and variety of methods available so that different women can participate however is most appropriate for them. And then I've highlighted that share and implement piece because it is absolutely critical that we not only share back the findings, that we implement the actions, that we evaluate the actions, but also that we make sure that that information that we're sharing back is accessible. And I'll talk in the next slide about the importance of language and definition. So when we're talking about both the research process where we're collecting the data, but also that share back communication piece, it's critical to talk about the language and making sure that the language is accessible. It's something that I struggle with for sure because I write more academically, I have a more academic background, but it's really critical to make sure that what we're sharing back, that information, we make it most accessible and make it feasible for everybody to engage with. Having very clear definitions of what we're looking for and what we're researching is also critical. The ethical framework as well for us was a big part of our process. It's also something that for us will now last beyond the research cycle because it's something that we can implement in future projects, really defining what the ethics process and engagement process is, how we engage with our communities, to what extent we will be sharing resources with our communities, but how they will also be engaging. And also questions of ownership and access and control. Who has access to the data? Again, these are some of the constraints that we face in our project, but giving, for us, it was giving the women as much access over their own data as possible. So having things like them being able to ask to remove their data when they were engaging in qualitative methods, sharing back our findings with the participants first before making them available to the community, things where we can give more ownership to the community and to the participants so that they feel that the outcomes really do reflect their experiences. So we'll go to the next. we did this through a variety of research methods, as I mentioned. And like Lucia mentioned, there's usually that quantitative, qualitative, but we really try to have much more types of methods available, things like photo voice, digital storytelling, or arts-based expression, so that women could engage to whatever level they were most comfortable. So we'll go next. And one of the key things that we were able to identify when we were talking about economic empowerment, we really wanted to move away from this conversation of access to just jobs or the labor market, to talking about access to gainful employment. And although we had a definition in mind, we really wanted our participants to be the ones to define this term for themselves. So through all of those different methods, we gave the women a chance to define what gainful employment meant to them. And here we have the outcomes of one of the quantitative aspects, which was asked through a survey question. We asked it as, what's the most important factors when you're looking for a job? In more qualitative settings, it looked like, tell me, what is your ideal job look like? What does your ideal employment look like? And from those pieces, we were able to define what gainful employment means. And now in our communications, we're really talking more about access to gainful employment rather than access to the labor market or economic empowerment, because it's something that was defined by the participants themselves. And we'll go to the next slide and the final slide. Some of the biggest challenges that we often come up against, and I'll talk about funding and time together. Those are usually constraints that exist for a lot of projects. So what's critical if we want to be as participatory as possible is to think about these in the proposal stage and really build these into our proposal. And I do have some tips from our project director, Sydney Piggott, who has done this more than I have in terms of negotiating funding. And there's definitely compromises to be made, but some things that we've done is definitely making sure we're compensating participants through honoraria, and indirectly if it's not possible, so making sure we're covering costs like childcare, food, transport, giving honoraria in form of a gift card, so that we're at least acknowledging the time and the energy that people are putting in participating in our research. A lot of times the challenge is we don't have the community connections, and that's where really we should be thinking about what connections we have before we even start to propose a research project. And it's really best to start with your own communities. And then sometimes, and the final challenge is that it's simply not us. Although we might have the best intentions and have the best goal and this research project that's amazing in mind, we might just not be the best suited to be carrying out that research. And at that point, it's the best question to ask is, how else can we support this goal? Whether it's providing financial support, providing time, expertise, how else can we help move this goal forward without being the ones who own the research project? And that is the end of that. I know I kind of zoomed through a bunch of things, so I'm really excited, looking forward to the breakout rooms to get more in depth. And I'll pass it on to Anna.
Hey, hello everyone, and thank you Shiva and Lucia. Shiva, you did wonderful, don't worry. I'm here, my name is Anna Duvant. I'm the Women's Rights Knowledge Specialist, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning at Oxfam Canada. And I'm here in particular to talk about integrating feminist approaches, not so much a set of tools, but an approach and a way of thinking to monitoring, evaluation, and learning, accountability and learning, research and learning, whichever acronym one feels like one wants to include in that title. And in particular, we'll be talking about a project called Creating Spaces to End Violence Against Women and Girls. Again, there's a few pieces to touch on here. What are Oxfam Canada's foundations or approaches to feminist monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning? What is Creating Spaces? What did we do within Creating Spaces to leverage some of these approaches? And what's upcoming? What's next? Creating Spaces is 5 years old, so how does that look in the future? The foundations to feminist meal are in a guidance note, which is online and probably promptly about to be shared with you in the chat box, looking at what Antu has been doing recently. But it is also online on Oxfam Canada's website, and there's 7 foundations. So again, we thought about and created the guidance note, not with the desire to create a set of tools at this stage, but to think about what are the approaches, foundations that will inform tools, that will inform processes when we approach feminist monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and feminist research in many ways as well. So again, that we're looking at it as an approach. And in many times and in many ways, we receive the question, how do you do feminist meal? And the answer is I have no one answer on that at all, because we're approaching this as a means of looking and a lens to put on top of meal. So also that feminist meal is an integral part of transformative change as a whole, both within our projects and then bigger and systemic within the communities and with the people who we work with. Shifting power to partners and participants, this will be a key piece within my upcoming example. Highlighting the evaluator as a facilitator, and so who has power in which elements of the work that we do. Valuing collective and context-driven knowledge. And I think Lucia made some great points about that, about how we think about the questions and the approaches and the tools that we use within the context of where we are working and the people who we are working with. That evaluations in particular provide a great learning orientation. And so instead of our traditional, I think the meal community as a whole has a traditional stereotypical extractive piece that in the past we could be criticized for kind of taking data and then not leveraging it back and doing something with that. And so really thinking about the learning orientation and the L within meal or MEL at all times, the L that is often forgotten. And that feminist meal is grounded in safe programming and do no harm in all elements of what we do. All right. Again, the guidance note is there, and you could read like 7 pages on all of those foundations. That's it. That's all you're going to get from me, because I want to talk about how it works within one of the examples of a project that Oxfam Canada has now worked on since 2016. And I flagged that date in particular because many of you will realize that is at the onset of the FIAP, the Feminist International Assistance Plan time period. And I think Creating Spaces provides an interesting example of a project that was really rolled out right at the beginning, the FIAP time period, and how this was designed prior to the FIAP, but how we've responded and tried to kind of grow at the same time as the policy itself grew. And so every time that we struggle through Creating Spaces with how to really think about feminist meal work, in parallel, Global Affairs Canada is often kind of thinking about how to deal with monitoring and evaluation within the FIAP. And I think we're on some parallel tracks here, which has been an interesting experience. So Creating Spaces, the ultimate outcome is to reduce violence against women and girls and child and early forced marriage in 6 countries: Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Nepal, Pakistan, and the Philippines. That is my second highlight. 6 countries means 6 opportunities for complex endeavors. And there are originally 25 local implementing partners working within those 6 countries in various allotments. So some countries have more partners than others. And that again increases the complexity and the lessons and the challenges that we will speak of in a few minutes. That is our world. That's it. All right, I'm gonna hone in on our midterm review, which happened between 2018 and 2019. And that kind of the ambitions and then the lessons and the next steps that we were able to receive by going through that process. And again, an ambitious process. So part 1 in this diagram was to be led by an external reviewer managed by Oxfam, and by that is by Oxfam Canada. And that was largely our quantitative and our survey element and some of the qualitative pieces associated with the survey and all of the information that has to feed into the PMF, the performance measurement framework, and a lot of our compliance-driven expectations. Part 2 is led by partners. I'm going to skip to that in the next slide, so I won't delve as in depth, but that is really where a lot of the ambitions about implementing and testing different elements of feminist meal were located. And then part 3 was a way to combine part 1 and part 2 in a validation and sense-making exercises. All right, so you saw all the ambitions, which were clearly a lot. I will also flag that I came on to this project in the midst of the midterm review. So that process I did not design, but I inherited it, everything that came with it, into my work. Let's think about the different stakeholders and any piece of work that we do and the way that we think about kind of working with meal processes. Oxfam Canada is there, but there's also Oxfam country teams at the 6 countries we worked with in Creating Spaces, the 25 local implementing partners, the donor, and how each group came to the midterm evaluation and in a larger sense came to meal work with different expectations. And this continues to ricochet into conversations up until today about other aspects of our meal work. And so everyone's coming at it with a different lens. And I think that's important when we're trying to implement foundations or approaches that are a little bit less standard, to remember where everyone is coming from is not the same. So one element of this midterm review, and I'm screeching past 10 months of project history in 10 minutes, is the peer-to-peer approach, which, if you remember back to part 2, was the way that partners were being encouraged to participate in mutual capacity building as well as mutual data collection and sense-making activities. And so, for example, this picture is from Nepal, and there are 4 districts that we work in Nepal and 4 different partners working in each of those districts. And they developed a set of learning questions together as the partners, but then they also crossed and visited each other's districts, partner 1 to partner 4 and partner 4 to partner 2, those numbers are not specific, in order to really learn about methods employed by their peers, to demonstrate what success looks like through their own perspectives. And sometimes this was done through focus group discussions. For example, other countries like in the Philippines, they did an entire outcome harvesting process through the partners themselves. And so that led to that exchange and that learning orientation to evaluations, as well as the evaluator was the facilitator. They weren't the collector of this piece. So that's one example of qualitatively how we try to integrate feminist meal into the midterm review. The quantitative approach I'm going to save for the breakout rooms, but there was a corresponding quantitative approach going on at the same time. Just a few lessons learned, again, about embracing the principles and the processes, not this idea that there is one tool that we must follow. Capacity sharing and strengthening. The number of times I hear capacity building, yeah, I would argue that quite a few of our partners felt as if their capacity was built, but also every time that myself or our country team colleagues or other people can engage, we build our own capacities as well. And that's extra important to remember. I think Shiva already mentioned this, but extra time, effort, time, again, time. This all takes longer than anything that we've done before. And hiring the right consultants. So much work that happens through meal is consultancy based because of these gaps in HR and time. And if you do not get the right consultants engaging with you, and the right consultants is part of that process from the beginning, it gets stickier and stickier at each step where we move forward with what the visions are. Next steps. We are working at Oxfam Canada from every project that we develop now to really increase and integrate meal budget at a higher percentage and a higher perspective from the beginning. And so that we can avoid some of the gaps that happen down the line. And that is lessons from creating spaces. Longer planning timelines. And so let's start thinking, the creating spaces final evaluation is just about ready to start. We have a lot of different moving elements, but the 6 countries, as well as ourselves hiring a lead consultant, getting the plan built from this midterm, we started last January. And it takes to really build out the plan and ensure that all the country teams, all the partners, everyone's on board with what the vision is, to have that reciprocal back and forth. This is a long, long time coming. Again, targeting feminist evaluators and making that a concerted effort from the beginning, separating, to some degree, separating when we, I'm wary about this line because I do think surveys and participatory moments can happen together, but I also think sometimes they have to happen apart. And when you try to layer on too many expectations at the same time, we can create pressures and undue stress that is actually anti-feminist in its own way. And to be aware of how much we're trying to layer on at any given moment in time. And then really integrating the time for sense making and knowledge products and feedback, which is something Lucia and Shiva already mentioned. So I shall leave it at that. Calais is next from MEDA. Over to you.
I'm Calais. I'm a Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Specialist, or Jessie. We love acronyms in the gender game. So Jessie Specialist at MEDA. So MEDA is a nonprofit organization operating out of Waterloo and several other locations that looks at improving Jessie outcomes through market systems. So today I'm going to be speaking about how we applied a more feminist tool or methodology in one of our projects in northern Nigeria called Gender Progress Markers. So the image on the left here summarizes the Nigeria Way, or Women in Youth, so I'll call it WAY for short, in a nutshell. So it's a 5-year project operating in Bauchi State of northern Nigeria. And we're currently in year 4, so we're coming up to the end. The project supports women and youth entrepreneurs in 3 value chains, so rice, soya, and groundnut. A bit about the gender norms context. There's strong traditional and conservative gender and social norms, including female seclusion, or PERDA, which impacts women's mobility and access to market information and resources. There's a high prevalence of poverty and early and forced girl-child marriage. Women are involved in economic activity, and they play a very important role in family sustenance, but they're often more informal and smaller scale. Men and traditional and religious authorities are key influencers in gender norms, as are grandmothers. So the project partnered with the Federation of Muslim Women's Associations in Nigeria, or FOMWAN, I'll call it for short. So through the community and social dialogue activities that FOMWAN, our partner, does, they look to improve the status of Muslim women and children to promote positive gender norms. So the image in the center demonstrates some of the priority community and gender-based issues that are identified by the project stakeholders in collaboration with FOMWAN for a focus within the project. And then the image on the right demonstrates the change model process that FOMWAN utilizes in engaging community members in dialogue to promote women and girls empowerment and also to foster gender equality. So gender progress markers, or GPM for short, are defined as a set of specific achievable indicators, or mini indicators. It's usually a set of 15 graduated statements that describe a progression of change, gender, and social behaviors in a target group. The statements are grouped into behaviors that one would expect, like, and love to see as a result of the impact of a project. So they come from outcome mapping. So Anna just mentioned outcome harvesting. So outcome mapping is an IDRC methodology, and CARE Canada actually was one of the first to experiment with applying this methodology, gender progress markers, to assess gender-related behavior change. So above here in the slide, the image demonstrates the journey that one of MEDA's other projects in Jordan took to developing and applying this methodology. So GPM can promote also both qualitative and quantitative assessment of gender equality and empowerment. In Jordan, the team quantitatively scored or tallied GPM statements. And MEDA, is also experimenting with a similar approach in our project in Senegal, where indicators will be aligned with a tool that's indexed against a quantitative score. So that's a nice strength of the tool. So the GPM methodology can be described as a more feminist approach to meal monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, as Anna was just speaking about. Because it's participant driven, it highlights the voices of, in this case, women entrepreneurs, their spouses, and other key influencers. It enables women to define their personal empowerment journey in their own terms, and allows the project team to better understand the nuances of gender equality and empowerment work. It's localized, so capacity strengthening of local boundary partners is important for successful implementation. And these activities really drive social change impact in way beyond the life of the project. While it's a monitoring approach, it's also a gender transformative activity, as it allows for dialogue between spouses and family members on issues that may not have come up or been discussed otherwise, which is really interesting. It also is accountable because it requires longitudinal implementation and trust building between partners, project staff, and participants. So that's a nice strength of the tool as well. So in the pilot in the Nigeria Way project, the communities, there were 3 communities here that are listed. They were selected due to geographic, demographic, and economic diversity, so we could get a nice kind of spread of outcomes. We did hire an expert consultant to help kick off our pilot. So the consultant was given the draft gender progress marker statements and domains of change, and these were developed with the project staff in collaboration with our partners. And then they were further refined and validated with the different stakeholders in the field. Our partner FOMWAN was trained on the method to be able to aid in the implementation in the project. And it was also seen as a capacity strengthening exercise for them, again, beyond the life of the project, to embrace and understand M&E in their own impact work. Data collection methods that were used was a survey tool, which was applied within a focus group. as well as it was supplemented by discussions and key informant interviews with key stakeholders. So the image on the right, I apologize, is probably quite small, but it demonstrates a sample of the survey tool that was used in this GPM methodology process. And it demonstrates some of these statements, graduated statements that were selected by the community. So some of the next steps for the Nigeria Way project, unfortunately, COVID-19 pushed back some of our data collection. Typically, these go in 6-month cycles. Excuse me, the pilot was in February, but now we'll have to push the next round of data collection into early 2021. Another really important step is to determine how we'll be planning a gender data feedback exercise with our participants as well as our partners so that we can establish this kind of positive feedback loop to continue to iterate and improve, and also to make that information continually accessible to those involved. So here are just some kind of nice snapshots of some of the supplementary discussion material that came out. So some of the discussions were around what does it mean to be an empowered woman, what does it mean to be a male ally, and what does gender equality mean to you? So having this more kind of qualitative feedback helps us to further define the GPM statements and also get a better understanding of the gender and social norms. So some of our learnings to date, so the Nigeria Way project is funded by Global Affairs Canada. It was designed pre-FIAP, and so it had broad-based outcomes and indicators regarding, partner capacity building, but these activities weren't meal-specific necessarily. So GPM as a tool was introduced later in the project, and it does, as Anna was just mentioning, require significant investment in resources and time to do this type of data collection work. So feminist meal also, I think, requires that you fully assess local partner capacity and build in budget and activities to address capacity gaps early on. So this is something that we noticed, and so the project was able to pivot and free up budget to hire on an M&E focal person for our partner, because that was something that they needed to meet the requirements. And in order for their own learning, of course, and to be able to participate more fully. In the Way project as well, unfortunately, the pilot has been a little bit more consultant driven rather than partner driven because of some of the complications and complexities I was just speaking about. But as mentioned, our partner FOM1 is still assisting this process and will be able to continue to use this method. So that element of localization is really important to the project's success. So through another point here that I pointed out on the slide is that through partner activities, we now have a much clearer picture of how a WRO or a women's rights organization like FOM1 understands gender equality and empowerment, but also how this can be divergent from project staff and donor expectations. So in dialogue with FOM1, it's been really interesting because there's been a little bit less of an awareness or a conversation around structural inequality within the communities. And rather, sometimes there's more of an assigning of blame to women or expectations around women in upholding communities, being self-sacrificing, and being kind of the guardians of these gender and social norms. And so having a conversation about that that's honest and frank has been really interesting. And this is going to be translating to exploring gender equality theory of change workshops with FOM1, but other partners as well on the project, so that we can get a better sense of where they're coming from, but also where the donor and MEDA is coming from. And we can all come to the table with some of our different expectations and conceptions of gender equality. And then finally, even though donor expectations may espouse feminist values, we know that's baked into the FIAP, we're still beholden to results-based management, or RBM, and measuring success through strict indicators, targets, and on a limited 4 to 5 year project lifespan, sometimes with finite meal budgets. Whereas, as I've kind of alluded to, truly feminist research techniques can be very time-consuming, longitudinal, fluid, and iterative, and it can be difficult to measure them. So this may incur trade-offs with donor reporting requirements, especially in a project. An example of this is that in another one of our projects, MEDA wanted to use the gender progress marker approach to define empowerment from a selection of women's perspectives once they were engaged in the project activities, and then use that definition within the project's measurement framework. But this approach wasn't satisfactory to the donor because of RBM requirements, and instead we were asked to include a predefined version of empowerment as part of the design. So that also speaks to potentially the need to like revisit your design later on to understand how our conceptions are changing, and bringing kind of your donor and other folks along for the ride to understand it as more of a dialogue over time. And I think that's it for me. The last slide is just where you can find our resource, and I believe it's already been shared by Antu. So thanks very much, everyone.
Over to you, Jessica. Thank you so much, Calais.
Great. Well, and so hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Ferne. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Director of Global Health Impact here at CanWaCH. I've made so many notes already in what my colleagues have shared, and you've all done an incredible job. We're actually bang on time, so that's remarkable. I'll try to keep my remarks nice and short so we can go into the breakout rooms where the magic happens. I really just want to speak a little bit here as to one of the many reasons why we wanted to have this conversation today, and why we're so grateful that you all took the time to join us during GE Week to specifically talk about measuring women's empowerment. So on my next slide, I wanted to just highlight that one of the things that we're working on here at CanWaCH is trying to compile and synthesize a lot of what we're hearing from folks like our colleagues here when it comes to guidance on how to measure empowerment. And this came about particularly in response to requests that we had for guidance that is practical and that can be used both on the partner side, the Canadian partner side, but also on the side of funders, kind of going to what Calais was just speaking to there about the importance of bringing everyone along for the process and talking about some of the practical considerations. And we also want to acknowledge the realities of the Canadian context. So we are operating within the context of the FIAP. We are, as CanWaCH, particularly interested in focusing in on issues of empowerment as relate to health and rights. And also we know that that's a primary area of Canadian investment and will continue to be. And we also want to acknowledge the realities of this COVID time and what this has done to everything from how data is collected to the ways in which programming is delivered, and also the ways in which our relationships with our local partners are potentially changing and shifting. How can we capture all of that in a guidance document that is succinct and also that doesn't duplicate what's out there? So, we've heard here from members and non-members of CanWaCH all sorts of great examples of the literature, tools, and work that's already happened. Our goal here is not to create yet another tool, but really to help guide and inform kind of those key questions that need to be answered. And of course, if that was easy to do, it would be done by now, right? So one thing, of course, that we're finding in this process is no shock to anyone. It's just how complex it is, and just how little agreement there is in many different ways. So we certainly don't have the hubris to think that we at CanWaCH are going to solve this issue and let you all know how it turns out. Instead, we're really trying to adopt the approach of this is where we're at in this moment in time. What is it that maybe we can kind of collectively agree on is the best approach, at least to take us forward into this next phase. Next slide, please, Talia. So, as we move into these small group discussions, we really would love to hear your thoughts and insights. And just to note, we will be taking the resources that folks have shared here, along with the many, many others that we've been compiling. And those are going to be part of the resources that we put out on this. So in addition to this conversation, don't worry, we'll be making sure that these and other resources are available to you. And we would really love to get thoughts and insights as to, really what are the guiding questions? What are the things that you ask of yourselves and your partners? What are the questions you get asked by your funders when they're looking at your work? Help us to understand, what that thought process is for you, so that we can kind of going back to, I think, Anna's point, you know, we're not looking to prescribe a specific way, but rather an approach and a way of thinking. And we'd love to hear what that thinking is for many of you. As well, if you have practical insights or case studies or examples from your work, we'd love to include them as part of the resource package that we're building together. So it's not just about, here's how you talk about empowerment within the context of a, you know, RBM approach, but instead really looking at kind of this broader system and where things fit together. So on the last slide I have here, my own contact information and that of my colleague Talia Glickman, who's here on the call as well. And we'll be reaching out, I think, in the follow-up to this as well. But just to let you know, if you see an email from one of these two people, please respond to it. And please share your thoughts and insights going forward. I think it's going to be integral to building on the great work of our colleagues here. I think that's right, takes us to right at 1 o'clock. So Antu, over to you to break us into some small group discussions, which I believe will be about 20-25 minutes.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Thank you all so very much for all your amazing insights. We're going to speed along, and Tina is going to be putting us into breakout rooms. There will be 3 breakout rooms. You'll have a CanWaCH facilitator, but you'll also have 1 or 2 of the speakers. And please just participate, and that's all. So over to you, Tina, as you work your magic. Fantastic. I hope everyone had some really interesting conversations. I know we did. I know Annie had a really great question that she shared as well about how to expand our approach with feminist meal, both upwards and downwards, beyond just the MEL folks or the GE folks. How do we talk about impact and the work we have to do with empowerment beyond just within those who are actively doing that work? I think I'm getting a question just really quickly. All right, yep, we may have lost a few people in their final thoughts, and I apologize for that, but we also appreciate that many of you participated and showed up with your insights. And we are, again, collecting a lot of this information to support our guidance notes, so all of it is well appreciated. And because of that, thank you, Melanie. Yes, exactly, great presentations and insightful questions. Definitely a resonating feeling across the board. I would like to turn it over very briefly, if I can, to some speakers and panelists for how their takeaway went. So over to you, Lucia, if you would like to start us off with what you found as the main takeaway from your conversation.
Sure, yes. So we had some really good discussion about the tensions of both interacting with donors and being the midpoint between donors and program participants, but also balancing the tensions between quantitative and qualitative. So I think one of my biggest takeaways was just trying to build in as many opportunities for flexibility and feed between, especially with managing donor expectations, and also for letting qualitative data collection systems feed into quantitative approaches and vice versa. But Shiva was also in my section, so if there's anything to add, please jump in.
No, that was great. I think a key takeaway for me in that qualitative and quantitative discussion was a point brought up by Marissa around really centering cultural safety and the safety of our participants in our research. And I think that's a key consideration when we talk about those managing relationships with donors and funders as well, is if we really do want to center our participants, what does that negotiation look like, and what do those conversations look like? I know it's not easy, so it's great hearing tips from everybody in terms of how to really negotiate with funders and donors.
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing is, where can we find room for flexibility in terms of timing and relationship management, and working within the community to allow them to define how they will measure empowerment, of course. Over to you, Anna, for thoughts on your group's takeaways.
Sure, and thank you to everyone in my conversation. I think I'll just pick up on a point in relation to the first question about serving as the intermediary between the donors. And local partners and how to, some of the challenges incorporated there. And I think just one point that was important to me and that I need to bring forward continually in my own work is finding the right entry point when we have conversations with different donors, but particularly one donor that many of us have in mind. Whether it's we're more often to speak with global affairs through program development or through PTLs, but having those chances to speak with people who actually focus on monitoring, evaluation, learning, research is relatively rare and hard fought. But when I have those opportunities, they often come out to be very fruitful. But how can we find those moments and those times more consistently to really engage with the people who understand meal processes and can help maybe build the case for having that greater time and space and money attached to doing so?
Really practical considerations moving forward that we will be sure to highlight in our guidance note. Absolutely, Anna. Really appreciate that. And over to you, Calais, for the final thoughts.
It sounds like we've had a lot of similar themes. So we also kind of got into the nitty-gritty of how to negotiate donor relationships and figuring out like how all of this stuff plays in early on. So how can meal be funded appropriately? How does it not just get kind of pigeonholed within a KM plan or individual success stories to your donor? But more consistently, how can it work into bigger tools like a performance measurement framework or another kind of guiding tool? And figuring that out early on. And Daniela, who was in our group, was talking about how she's actually encountered significant flexibility and dialogue with a donor in conversation regarding measurement and bringing their own experts to the table about how to do this well and how to figure it out so that everybody can succeed ultimately. And yeah, really kind of keeping an eye on, again, on the resourcing. So Melanie from World Vision was with our group as well, and she talked about how sometimes it risks the meal budget being one of the first ones cut if you're not kind of figuring out early on what are the tools and approaches you'll apply. So yeah, just getting into the nitty-gritty of the design, I think is a big takeaway.
Absolutely. Design, stakeholder engagement, starting from the beginning, having this thoughtful process throughout around empowerment. All really great insights and practical suggestions. I hope that many of you have taken away today. I was jam-packed. I really appreciate all of those of you who have stayed until the very end. If you want to connect with our wonderful panelists, these are their emails. And again, we just really want to say thank you for being here. We will, of course, be continuing this conversation at CanWaCH, and stay tuned as we talk more and more about our guidance note in the coming months. But with that, we just once again want to thank you all for taking the time, and thank you very much to our panelists for also taking the time today to share their experiences with us today. We hope you have an amazing rest of Gender Equality Week. We have lots more programming, so if you want to keep joining CanWaCH, here we are for today and tomorrow as well. So thank you all so very much. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day wherever you are.